There are tales that endure for millennia. They are recounted by educators, inscribed in textbooks, and quoted during ceremonial speeches. They become an integral part of us, just as familiar as the air we breathe. And that is precisely why, when the truth is finally revealed, the blow can be especially devastating. You are holding in your hands not just a collection of historical corrections. This is an archive of revelations, 30 narratives about how humanity gazed into the mirror and saw there something that never existed. If you are ready to uncover the truth about the myths believed for centuries, support this series with a like and share in the comments. Which revelation shocked you the most? It will inspire us to explore new archives. Myth number 1. The hero who never reached his destination. Imagine a dusty trail from Marathon to Athens. The 21st day of the month Boudroumion in the ancient Greek calendar, roughly mid-September in our reckoning. Somewhere behind lies a battlefield where the Persian forces under Darius suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a small Athenian army. Ahead is the city awaiting its news, and in the middle of this path is a man running with all his strength, gasping for breath yet not stopping. His name is Phidippides, or Philippides, or Euclides. History has not been particularly concerned with accuracy in names, as precision was never its strong suit in this legend. This tale is known to every school child. It is taught in history classes as a symbol of heroism, self-sacrifice, and fidelity to duty. The soldier ran 42 kilometers and 395 meters from the battlefield to Athens, managed to shout, "Neniki kamen, we have won," and collapsed dead. A whole sport emerged from this legend, which is now part of the Olympic Games. The marathon is one of the most recognized types of competitions worldwide. Millions of people conquer this distance each year, believing they are honoring the memory of a man who died from running. But here's the surprising part. This story never existed in the form everyone knows. Let's explore where it originated. Herodotus, the father of history, the main witness and chronicler of the Greco-Persian Wars, does indeed mention Phidippides. However, in his version, this man did not run from Marathon to Athens. He was heading the entirely opposite direction, and for an entirely different reason. Before the battle at Marathon, the Athenians, realizing the odds were against them, sent a messenger to Sparta to request military assistance. Phidippides was this messenger. He ran not 42 kilometers, but approximately 240 kilometers one way, from Athens to Sparta, in 2 days. This is a truly phenomenal feat, far more impressive than the legendary run. The Spartans refused to help. They were busy with a religious festival and could not march until the next full moon. Phidippides then turned around and ran 240 kilometers back. Herodotus doesn't mention any run from Marathon to Athens at all. So, where did the widely known story come from? The first to mention it was Plutarch, about 500 years after the events. Plutarch himself was uncertain about the specifics and referred to a certain Heraclides of Pontus, a 4th century BCE writer who recounted a version that was popular among the people. The name of the runner in Plutarch's account is not Phidippides, but rather Euclides. Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century CE satirist, provided another narrative in which the messenger is named Philippid. This version ultimately triumphed in popular memory, despite lacking any documentation from the time of the events. Now we reach the most captivating part. The tale of the runner dying after the race emerged later and appears to be a pure rhetorical fabrication, an appealing embellishment for oratorical speeches. No contemporary accounts support this claim. However, it fit perfectly with the Greek concept of heroic death, dying for one's homeland. To die with a victorious shout on one's lips? This image resonated far more than the dull reality of a living runner who simply arrived in the city and went to sleep. But the most astonishing twist in this story occurred in 1896, when the Olympic Games were revived in Athens. French philologist Michel Bréal proposed establishing a race over the historical distance. The organizers agreed. The distance was measured anew, tracing the route from the village of Marathon to the Olympic Stadium in Athens, resulting in approximately 40 kilometers. The first victor, a Greek courier named Spyridon Lewis, finished to a thunderous roar from the crowd. Greece gained a national hero. The myth became a competition. The competition morphed into a tradition. This tradition became part of human culture. Now, every year, millions of people traverse the distance measured in honor of an event that never occurred, in tribute to a man who died differently and ran in the opposite direction. The essence of this irony is steeped in over 5 centuries of errors and embellishments. The real Phidippides ran 6 times further, called for help that never arrived, and seemingly returned home alive. His true feat was far grander than what posterity chose to remember. Yet, 240 kilometers there and back, without a fatal conclusion, seemed unsuitable material for a legend. Truth is often humbler than myth. But at times it can also be more majestic, just in a different sense. This myth emerged from a desire to give an event an elegant form. The next myth arose from a longing to ascribe pure meaning to a revolution. Yet history rarely allows anything to be truly pure. Myth number 2. A revolution that brought freedom to no one. On the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd storms the Bastille. The heavy gates of the fortress crash down. Prisoners emerge into the light. The people rejoice. This is the moment from which, according to popular belief, the age of democracy and freedom began. The Great French Revolution is depicted in school textbooks as a triumphant march of reason over tyranny, a sacred birth of the values upon which the modern Western world stands: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Imagine believing in something your entire life. Now picture being asked to tally how many people lost their lives during the very early years of this freedom. Let's start with the Bastille, a symbol. On the day it fell, there were 7 prisoners inside. 7. 2 of them were patients suffering from mental illnesses, whom their families had placed there to rid themselves of troublesome relatives. 4 were con artists convicted of forging documents, and 1 nobleman was imprisoned at the request of his own family due to debauchery. No political prisoners, no victims of tyranny. The revolution freed 2 madmen and 5 criminals and called it the dawn of liberty. But this is just the first of many illusions. The subsequent years of the French Revolution entered history as the Reign of Terror. And this is no metaphor. From September 1793 to July 1794, a mere 10 months, the Revolutionary Tribunal issued approximately 17,000 death sentences. According to historians' rough estimates, between 40 and 50,000 people were executed without trial or died in prisons. The guillotine, a supposedly humane invention of the Enlightenment era, meant to make execution painless and equal across all social classes, operated with the precision of a factory machine. The most horrifying aspect is who was responsible for sending people to the blade. Not aristocrats, not the old regime. It was the revolutionaries themselves. Maximilien Robespierre, a brilliant lawyer from Arras, a man known as the Incorruptible for his fanatical integrity, led the Committee of Public Safety and transformed it into a tool of mass annihilation. His victims included not just nobles, but also fellow revolutionaries, those deemed insufficiently revolutionary or, conversely, too radical. Georges Danton, one of the revolution's founders, was beheaded. Camille Desmoulins, a journalist whose pamphlets had ignited the crowd in 1789, shared the same fate. The revolution consumed its children with an appetite that even the despised monarchy could not imagine. And what about freedom of speech? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in August 1789, ceremoniously proclaimed the freedom of expression. Yet, merely 4 years later, the Revolutionary Tribunal was sending people to the guillotine for a carelessly spoken word, for not shouting, "Long live the Republic," loudly enough, or for merely possessing a portrait of the executed king. Freedom of the press lasted only a few months, after which the Jacobins shut down most newspapers that did not share their views. What about women's rights? Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, was arrested and guillotined in 1793. The revolution, which proclaimed equality, denied women the right to vote, the right to engage in political life, and the right to an education equal to that of men. And the peasants, those for whom all of this was supposedly initiated? In the Vendée, a French province in the west of the country, they dared to rise against the revolutionary government. They were angered by forced conscription into the army, the closure of churches, and the destruction of their way of life. The response was a punitive expedition, which historians refer to as the first genocide of the modern era. The hellish columns, voies infernales, swept through the province with fire and sword. Estimates suggest that between 150,000 and 250,000 individuals lost their lives. Entire villages were burned to the ground. General Turreau ordered that no one be spared, neither men, nor women, nor children. All of this occurred under the banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So, where did this appealing myth originate? Partially from the very revolutionary propaganda, which was adept at creating images with an intensity rivaling that of contemporary Hollywood films. It also stemmed from the political needs of subsequent eras. Both Napoleon and the Republican governments of the 19th century sought a noble foundation. Additionally, the harsh truth about the Terror is too inconvenient for any nation that wishes to consider itself the cradle of democracy. The true French Revolution was a grand, contradictory, bloody, and genuinely historically significant process. It did indeed change Europe. It truly put an end to the feudal system. However, it did not immediately bring freedom and democracy. Instead, it brought chaos, violence, new forms of tyranny, and only after decades and multiple regimes began to transform into what we now refer to as democratic values. Freedom is never born swiftly. This myth thrived on blood. The next one, a lack of gold. More precisely, its complete absence. Myth number 3, pirates seeking something other than what you think. The black spot. A map with an X. A chest of the dead man's fortune. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. The image of the Caribbean pirate has become so ingrained in culture that it has nearly become an archetype. A daring free sailor, burying treasure on a deserted island and leaving a coded map for future generations. Hollywood has eagerly exploited this imagery, and today, millions of people are convinced that the main occupation of Caribbean pirates was searching for and burying treasure. This is one of the most captivating yet utterly inaccurate myths in history. Let's begin with the most obvious point. The practice of burying treasure was an exceedingly rare exception, not the norm. Pirates were first and foremost entrepreneurs, cynical and ruthless, but entrepreneurs nonetheless. Their objective was to amass wealth quickly, not to store assets for the long term underground. To bury treasure meant to postpone funds that were immediately needed for provisions, ship repairs, new weapons, alcohol, and women in the nearest harbor. The logic of pirate economics worked exactly in the opposite direction. Seize, spend, back to the sea. Historians can name literally one documented pirate who actually buried part of his treasures. This was William Kidd, Captain Kidd, a Scottish seafarer operating in the late 17th century. However, he buried his valuables not because he wished to create a hiding place for future generations. He concealed them because he knew he would be arrested and hoped to use them as leverage in negotiations. The ace did not play. He was hanged in 1701. A portion of the treasure was discovered even during his lifetime. There's no romance here whatsoever. But where did all this tale about maps and crosses originate? It can be attributed to a single individual, Robert Louis Stevenson. In 1883, he released Treasure Island. The book was crafted for the amusement of his stepson and became a phenomenal commercial and cultural phenomenon. The map of the island, drawn by Stevenson himself for the illustrations of the novel, entrenched the buried treasure as a fundamental aspect of the pirate image. Prior to this novel, such a persistent image in culture was virtually non-existent. So what were the Caribbean pirates actually up to, especially during the golden age of piracy, from 1650 to 1730? They were engaged in far more mundane and significantly more complex activities. A considerable number of them began as privateers, that is, pirates officially licensed by the government. The English, French, and Dutch crowns issued privateering licenses that authorized assaults on Spanish trading vessels. This was a legal business sanctioned by the state. Henry Morgan, often portrayed today as a bloodthirsty pirate, was more a military entrepreneur in service of the English crown, and he ended his life as the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. The true economy of piracy revolved around slavery, smuggling, and the trade of plundered goods, textiles, spices, metals, which were immediately sold in ports. Some pirates established entire logistical chains. They had buyers on shore, corrupt officials, and trading networks. This was a shadow economy, not a romantic adventure of lone individuals. The most astonishing fact that dismantles the pirate myth is that many pirate ships operated under something akin to a democratic charter. Captains could be re-elected. The loot was divided according to established rules. Ordinary sailors received specified shares, and there were compensations for injuries. Codes of conduct existed. Some of these codes predated similar documents in law-abiding societies. Pirates invented something resembling an early social contract, long before that term entered the realm of philosophy. Thus, the Caribbean pirates did not bury treasures, draw maps with crosses, or build their fortune on secrets. They were brutal, pragmatic maritime entrepreneurs, some of whom operated with governmental endorsement, and their romance was constructed by 19th-century writers retroactively. The real history of piracy is a tale of colonial economy, state violence, slavery, and human ingenuity in extreme conditions. Far less romantic, much more humane, and significantly more terrifying. This myth was crafted by a writer for the sake of a captivating story. The next one existed on its own, simply because the name proved too compelling. Myth number 4. A war that wasn't a war. The term 100 Years' War, just saying it feels like a sentence. A century of relentless bloodshed between France and England. 100 years of campaigns, sieges, battles, where cavalry crushes infantry and archers alter the course of history. 100 years without respite. This is how it is taught in schools. This is how it is portrayed in films. This is how it survives in the collective consciousness. Consider the dates: 1337 to 1453, 116 years, no longer a century. But let's assume it's merely rounding. The main issue lies elsewhere. There was no singular event known as the 100 Years' War. This term was coined by French historians in the 19th century to refer to a series of distinct conflicts, truces, treaties, and periods of peace connected by a common cause: territorial and dynastic claims of English kings to the French throne. The very term 100 Years' War was not used by contemporaries of the events. They viewed these as separate wars with different names: the Edwardian War, the War of Charles V, the Lancastrian War. They fought, made peace, fought once more, and so it went several times. Truces and peaceful periods occupied a significant portion of these 116 years. Following the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 and the capture of the French king John II, the parties signed a peace treaty at Bretigny in 1360. This peace lasted 9 years, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without experiencing war. Then, war resumed. Then a truce. Following that, a lull of almost 40 years, until Henry V resumed military actions in 1415. If one totals all the periods of active conflict, it becomes clear that actual warfare constituted less than half of those 116 years. However, more crucial is this: the very notion of war between France and England as two nations is an anachronism. In the 14th century, there was no French nation in the modern sense. The southern part of France spoke the Occitan language and viewed the northern Paris region with suspicion. The Burgundians, one of the largest regions, at one point sided with the English and actively fought against their own countrymen. Many French nobles had obligations to the English crown through a system of feudal oaths. This was not a war between two nations. Rather, it was a series of feudal conflicts retrospectively reinterpreted by descendants as a national struggle. The most prominent example of this reinterpretation is Joan of Arc. Her image and contemporary understanding is thoroughly national. She fights for France against England. Yet, in 1429, the concept of France as a unified entity did not exist for most French people. Joan fought for the legitimate heir to the French throne, Charles VII, against those supporting another claimant. This was more of a civil war with foreign involvement than a conflict between two states. Why then did 19th century historians forge these conflicts into a single narrative? Because the 19th century was an era of nationalism. It was a time of forming nation-states, national myths, and national history. France required an epic tale of its struggle for existence, while England sought a narrative of heroic conquests. The Hundred Years' War was perfectly suited for both narratives, needing only to intertwine disparate conflicts into one monumental story. The reality, however, was far more complex, less linear, and much closer to the human experience, filled with compromises, retreats, days of inactivity, and years when both sides simply tiredly stared at each other across the channel. Historians crafted this myth for ideological reasons, while the following narrative arose from awkwardness. Myth number 5. The illiterate barbarian who created the world's first postal system, Genghis Khan. Just the sound of this name resonates like a thunderclap. A Mongolian warrior emerging from the steppes, drenched in blood, who traveled from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. In the collective consciousness, he is portrayed as the embodiment of primal power, devoid of any refinement, an illiterate nomad capable only of killing and burning. The quintessential barbarian, the complete antithesis of civilization. This concept has become so deeply ingrained that even serious historical works occasionally perpetuate it. Yet each of its components is either incorrect or in dire need of reevaluation. Let's begin with literacy. Temujin, the real name of Genghis Khan, was raised in the harsh environment of the Mongolian steppe, where a written tradition was indeed absent. The Mongolian language lacked its own script until his reforms. However, Temujin did not merely accept this situation as a given. Around the year 1204, after conquering the Naimans, one of the Mongolian tribes, he discovered an Uyghur scribe named Tatar Tonga among the captives. Rather than executing him or enslaving him, Genghis Khan ordered him to adapt the Uyghur script for the Mongolian language. This was a deliberate state reform, the foundation of the first written form of the Mongolian language. He also commanded that his sons be educated in it. A man who could neither read nor write established a writing system for an entire nation. Next, consider the legal system. The Mongolian Yasa, the code of laws established by Genghis Khan, ranked among the most systematic legal documents of its time. It governed trade, taxation, military service, judicial processes, and diplomacy. The Yasa prohibited blood feuds, established rules of inheritance, and contained articles on religious tolerance, remarkable by 13th century standards. The Mongolian Empire officially proclaimed the equality of all religions before the law during a time when the European Inquisition was sending people to the stake for heresy. The postal system, the Yam, was a true technological marvel. Throughout the empire, from China to Poland, stations with horses and provisions were spaced at regular intervals. Couriers could cover in a single day a distance that would have taken an ordinary traveler a week. Government and military messages were transmitted through this network with astonishing speed. Marco Polo, who visited the empire half a century after Genghis Khan's death, recounted this system with unabashed admiration and astonishment. Trade. The renowned Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, allowed the trade routes of the Silk Road to operate with an efficiency that was unprecedented both before and after this period. Merchants from China could reach the Mediterranean relatively safely because the entire region was under unified governance. Genghis Khan personally ensured the safety of trade routes and imposed harsh penalties on those who attacked merchants. For someone typically regarded as an adversary of civilization, he exhibited remarkable concern for the infrastructure of exchange. Religious policy. Although Genghis Khan practiced traditional Mongolian shamanism, his court was home to Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Taoists, and Confucians. His close associates and military commanders adhered to various faiths. This was not mere tolerance. It was a deliberate policy that enabled him to govern a vast multicultural empire. How did the image of the illiterate barbarian arise? From the accounts of the vanquished. Most written records about the Mongols were created by those who suffered at their hands: Chinese, Persian, Russian, and European chronicles. Survivors depicted the conquerors in the bleakest terms, and it's understandable. The destruction was real, and there were countless victims. However, devastation is only one aspect of the Mongolian narrative. The contributions made were another and are often discussed far less. Genghis Khan was one of the most pragmatic and administratively adept rulers in human history. His illiteracy, if it existed in the sense we understand today, did not hinder him from establishing governmental institutions that his successors would inherit to manage the largest land empire ever seen on Earth for 2 centuries. This myth emerged from fear of the other, of what proved to be stronger. The next arose from a flawed understanding of how discoveries are made. Myth number 6. An explosion no one planned. 1867. Alfred Nobel stands in his laboratory, observing spilled nitroglycerin. According to the popular legend, famously repeated countless times, it was at this moment that chance led to the discovery of dynamite. The chemical absorbed into diatomaceous earth, a loose substance used to pack the boxes transporting nitroglycerin, and Nobel suddenly realized he had found a way to make explosives controllable. Pure chance. Fate intervened, and the world changed. This tale is so compelling that it appears in every biography of Nobel. Unfortunately, it's almost certainly false, or rather, an oversimplification that distorts the real history beyond recognition. Alfred Nobel did not stumble upon this discovery. He arrived at it methodically, over years, with ruthless engineering logic. Nitroglycerin, a powerful explosive discovered by Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero in 1847, was known to be an incredibly unstable substance. Sobrero himself was against the industrial application of his invention. The liquid would explode with the slightest jolt, temperature fluctuation, or careless movement. Nobel, a young Swedish chemist raised in a family of inventors, took on the challenge of making nitroglycerin safe to handle. He experimented with various carriers and additives for many months and years. He combined nitroglycerin with coal, sawdust, and cement. He sought a substance that would absorb the liquid and diminish its sensitivity to impact while preserving its explosive power. Kieselguhr, a porous sedimentary rock made up of ancient algae shells, was among the many experimental carriers. When Nobel confirmed that the mixture of nitroglycerin and Kieselguhr retained its explosive qualities under mechanical stress, yet did not detonate from accidental impacts, it was not a revelation born of chance, but the logical outcome of years of dedicated work. The tale of spilled nitroglycerin is most likely apocryphal. It probably stems from popular biographies of the late 19th century, which favored compelling narratives about eureka moments and accidental discoveries. Such stories sell better than the truth about the patient engineer conducting experiments year after year in the laboratory. Nobel's personal history further undermines the legend of accident. In 1864, an explosion at the Nobel factory near Stockholm killed his younger brother Emil and another 4 workers. This explosion was not an accident in the conventional sense. It was a predictable consequence of working with unstable nitroglycerin. Following his brother's death, Alfred's father, Emanuel Nobel, suffered a stroke and never recovered. Alfred pressed on with his work, but with doubled determination and a clearer understanding of what needed to be accomplished. Not to discover something novel, but to solve a specific engineering problem. He received the patent for dynamite in 1867. It was not the result of a sudden insight, but rather the culmination of systematic research paid for by personal tragedy and years of hard work. If there is irony in this story, it lies elsewhere. The man who created one of the most destructive inventions of the industrial age was so shaken by the scale of its use in wars that, at the end of his life, he bequeathed much of his fortune to establish prizes for contributions to peace and the well-being of humanity. The Nobel Prize is a form of redemption, purchased with the proceeds from explosive sales. Chance plays no role here. This is a story about responsibility. This myth speaks of an inventor misunderstood. The next myth centers on a woman who was not understood at all. Myth number 7, the martyr of science. Who died not for science. Alexandria, 5th century CE. A woman philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer teaches in a city where science and pagan wisdom are on the verge of extinction under the onslaught of Christianity. Hypatia of Alexandria, a name that has become symbolic, a symbol of how religious fanaticism destroys knowledge. Her murder in the year 415 is commonly interpreted as a heinous act. A mob of Christian monks tore her apart precisely because she was a learned pagan, thereby extinguishing the last light of Alexandrian scholarship. This narrative has permeated culture through novels, films, and philosophical essays. Carl Sagan in Cosmos depicted her death as a symbolic end to ancient science. The film Agora, directed by Alejandro Amenabar and released in 2009, powerfully illustrated her martyrdom for science. However, the reality is more complicated, painful, and devoid of such convenient symbolism. Hypatia was indeed an extraordinary scholar. The daughter of the mathematician Theon of Alexandria, she inherited her father's chair and taught philosophy and mathematics, Neoplatonism, the works of Plotinus, the geometry of Apollonius, and astronomy of Ptolemy. Her students included individuals from various cities, including Christians. Synesius of Cyrene, one of her pupils who later became a Christian bishop, wrote her enthusiastic letters up until her death. She did not stand in opposition to Christianity per se. In 5th century Alexandria, there were no harsh distinctions between pagan science and Christian knowledge. So why was she killed? The answer lies in politics rather than theology. Alexandria in the early 5th century was a city rife with sharp political contradictions. Orestes, the Roman prefect of Egypt, was in an irreconcilable conflict with Cyril of Alexandria, the powerful bishop. This was a struggle between civil and church authority. Orestes was a Christian but refused to yield to ecclesiastical pressure. Hypatia was his friend and advisor. For Cyril's supporters, she was seen not as a pagan, but rather as a political ally of their adversary. The closest source to the events is the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, who wrote soon after Hypatia's demise. His wording is very precise. The mob killed her because her influence over the prefect hindered the reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril, a political assassination. The removal of someone whose influence obstructed the specific political goals of certain individuals. The connection between her death and the end of ancient science is a later interpretation. Alexandrian intellectual life did not cease in the year 415. The philosophical school of Alexandria continued to operate for over a century after Hypatia's death. The Alexandrian library, in its major form, was lost earlier. Its gradual decline spanned centuries and was not tied to any single event. Hypatia became a symbol of the end of ancient science largely in the 18th century, when Enlightenment figures, most notably Voltaire and Edward Gibbon, began to use her story as an argument in their conflict with the Church. They needed a strong image, and Hypatia's fate fit perfectly into that narrative, with a slight shift in focus. This does not mean that her murder was any less horrific. It does not imply that the religious violence to which she fell victim should be justified. To label her as a martyr of science, perishing specifically for her intellectual beliefs, is to replace the true account of a political assassination with a beautiful yet inaccurate allegory. The reality surrounding Hypatia is far more tragic and humane than the myth. She met her end due to her significance as a player in a perilous political game. Her power lay in her intellect and influence, and it was precisely for this that she was killed. This myth was fabricated by the Enlightenment thinkers, while the next was perpetuated by the Greeks themselves. Myth number 8, the Olympic peace that never existed. Every 4 years, the entire world halts all conflicts. Athletes gather in Olympia, the spirits of the gods hover over the stadium, and for several days humanity exists without bloodshed and violence. The Olympic truce, Ekacheria, remains one of the most resilient myths of ancient Greece. It is referenced during the opening ceremonies of the Games and cited by diplomats. It is employed as a rationale for the notion that sports can reconcile nations. However, the reality was considerably more modest. Ekacheria indeed existed. This is a historical fact. A truce was declared prior to each Olympic Games and entailed the cessation of hostilities during their duration. Yet, the first question that must be posed is, cessation of hostilities on what scale? The first clarification. The truce primarily applied to Elis, the region where Olympia was located, and to the routes taken by pilgrims and athletes traveling to the Games. It was more of a guarantee of safe passage than an all-Greek cessation of hostilities. The essence of Ekacheria was fundamentally practical, to allow athletes and spectators to reach Olympia without the fear of being killed during one of the numerous conflicts that continually raged across the Greek lands. The second clarification. The truce was violated, regularly. In the year 520 BC, the Spartans were penalized for their attack on lepra during the Olympic Games. In 524 BC, according to other sources during a different time frame, Sparta again breached the truce. In 420 BC, the Spartans were barred from participating in the Games due to military actions conducted during the period of Ekacheria. The third and most crucial clarification. The Olympic Games themselves were political to the core. Victories in these competitions provided immense propaganda value to the city-state. Athletes competed not as individual sportsmen, but as representatives of their polis. Winning was valued specifically because it enhanced the prestige of one's home city. Political alliances and enmities were played out directly within the stadium. Diplomatic meetings, political speeches, and displays of strength occurred at the same Olympic Games during the 5th and 4th centuries. Thucydides describes how Alcibiades, a brilliant yet controversial Athenian politician, entered 7 chariots in the 416th Olympic Games, aiming to impress allies and intimidate enemies. The Games were a political tool. And who was eligible to participate? Only free Greek men, not slaves, not women. They not only did not compete, but were entirely barred from the stadium under threat of death. Married women, unmarried women theoretically could watch. Not barbarians. This entire construct of peace and unity was a creation of the elite, devised for the elite, with strict limitations based on gender, status, and ethnic origin. The myth of the Olympic world is a beautiful concept, developed much later for political purposes. The modern phrases sport outside of politics and Olympic truce were largely articulated by Baron Pierre de Coubertin and other organizers of the revived Olympic Games in the late 19th century. They needed historical legitimation for their project and projected an idealized image onto the distant antiquity. The ancient Greeks fought before, during, and after the Olympic Games. This myth of peace and unity crumbles under a single scrutinizing glance. Next is the one about the fire that the supposedly mad ruler allegedly witnessed. Myth number 9. Nero, the fiddle, and the fire that never was. July 64 of our era. Rome is ablaze. The fire, originating from the area of the Circus Maximus, spreads with monstrous speed through the wooden quarters of the greatest city in the world. For 7 days, the fire consumes Rome. And on a hill, in safety, stands the young emperor Nero, playing the fiddle, admiring the flames that he himself ignited. This image is one of the most enduring in history. It serves as a metaphor for irresponsible leadership, the selfishness of power, and the madness of tyranny. Playing the fiddle while Rome burns has become an idiom in many languages. Almost everything in this depiction is incorrect. Let's start with the basics. The fiddle did not exist in the 1st century of our era. This instrument was invented in northern Italy around the 16th century. Ancient sources describing Nero playing during the fire mention the kithara, a stringed instrument related to the lyre. The fiddle appeared in this narrative much later when it transitioned into the European cultural tradition. However, what's more crucial is what exactly Nero was doing during the fire. At the moment the fire began, Nero was in Antium, modern-day Anzio, about 50 kilometers from Rome. Upon learning of the fire, he immediately returned to the capital. Tacitus, the main source for this period, who was not particularly friendly to Nero, still reports that the emperor personally directed firefighting and rescue operations. Nero opened his gardens, the Campus Martius, and several public buildings for the victims. He organized food supplies from Ostia and reduced grain prices. After the fire, he implemented a large-scale rebuilding plan for Rome with new construction codes, featuring wide streets, stone houses instead of wooden ones, and fire-resistant materials. All of this does not fit the image of a ruler who reveled in his city's destruction. The accusation of arson arose immediately, and Nero promptly sought to redirect it to the Christians, leading to the first large-scale persecution of Christians in Rome. However, ancient sources describe Nero's alleged arson very differently. Suetonius, who wrote half a century after the events, claims that Nero openly set fire to Rome. Tacitus, much more measured in his approach, states that it is unknown whether it was an accident or the princeps' malicious intent. Dio Cassius, writing even later, again asserts that the fire was intentional. The discrepancies among these sources are quite telling in themselves. What was the motive? Nero indeed sought to clear space for a grand construction project, his extravagant palace, the Golden House. Critics immediately pointed to this as evidence of his intent. However, the Golden House was built on land devastated by the fire, which could have been both a consequence of the blaze and the reason for it. The portrayal of Nero on the hill with a lyre first appears in Suetonius, a biographer valued by historians for his captivating narrative, though not known for analytical rigor. This detail could have been propaganda from the senatorial circles opposed to Nero, an exaggeration over time, or merely a literary embellishment. Nero was indeed a brutal and unstable ruler. This is a historical fact. Yet the image of the madman playing the fiddle while the city burns is a posthumous construct created by his political enemies and amplified over centuries of retelling. The real Nero, on the day of the fire, was engaged in rescue operations. This is less dramatic, but it is the truth. This myth revolves around a ruler despised by his elites. The next one involves the church, which we fail to comprehend. Myth number 10. The Church and Anatomy, a war that never happened. The Catholic Church supposedly prohibited the dissection of corpses. This is what everyone knows. Consequently, medieval physicians were ignorant. Thus, anatomy stagnated for 1,000 years. And so, Andreas Vesalius, who published his monumental treatise on the structure of the human body in 1543, was a revolutionary, challenging the Church's ban. The secularization of science liberated anatomy from millennia of shackles. This is a compelling narrative of the war between science and religion. Yet it is, in significant parts, incorrect. No universal church prohibition against the dissection of corpses ever existed. No papal document, church council, or official edict outright banned anatomical studies in principle. This legend partially stems from a misinterpretation of the papal bull by Boniface VIII, De Testande Veritatis, from 1299, but this bull prohibited not dissection, but the boiling of crusaders' bodies to transport their bones back home. It had nothing to do with anatomy. The true history of medical anatomy during the Middle Ages looks quite different. As early as 1279, the University of Bologna received permission to conduct public dissections. Montpellier, Padua, Naples, medical schools throughout Europe held anatomical demonstrations from the late 13th century. Mondino de Luzzi, a professor from Bologna, performed the first documented public dissection in 1306 and authored Anatomy, the first medical textbook based on actual dissections. The Church not only did not prohibit these practices, it actively supported them. Numerous medical faculties that conducted anatomical dissections operated within monasteries and under the Church's patronage. Pope Sixtus IV in the late 15th century clearly endorsed anatomical research in Rome. Pope Clement VII personally sponsored anatomical studies. So why did anatomy develop so slowly during the Middle Ages? The reasons were far more mundane. There was a scarcity of corpses. The law restricted the use of bodies from executed criminals. The tradition of authoritative knowledge was deeply entrenched. Galen, whose work dominated medicine, had only dissected animals and not humans, and his descriptions often did not align with reality, but correcting the great authority posed social and academic risks. The techniques for preserving bodies were inadequate. These were practical limitations and not religious prohibitions. Vesalius himself, often depicted as a challenger of ecclesiastical dogmas, worked at the University of Padua, which was under the jurisdiction of the Venetian Republic, yet in a cultural space where the church did not hinder his efforts. He received corpses for dissection through official and legal channels. His revolution was one of methodology. He performed dissections himself instead of reiterating Galen, rather than a rebellion against clerical restrictions. The myth of the Church's war on anatomy was crafted during the Enlightenment as part of a broader narrative about the dark ages of religion being succeeded by the light of science. This was a political argument in an ideological dispute. The history turned out to be much more nuanced. This myth is about a conflict that never existed. The next one concerns a man who was misinterpreted by everyone. Myth number 11. The Buddha as incorrectly portrayed. In any Chinese restaurant around the world, in any souvenir shop from Bangkok to Buenos Aires, you will inevitably find him, a stout, laughing, bald monk with a large belly and a wide smile. He rubs his belly. This brings good luck. He sits in a relaxed posture, symbolizing contentment and abundance. His name is Buddha. He is the founder of Buddhism. Such is the commonly accepted version. This version is practically entirely false. The jolly, plump monk is not Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. He is quite another individual, a Chinese monk from the 10th century named Budai, also known as Hotei in Japanese tradition. Budai lived in the Zhejiang province during the Five Dynasties period and was known for his eccentricity, good-naturedness, and the habit of carrying a large sack filled with gifts for children. He became a character in folk legends and was later identified with the future Buddha Maitreya. However, Budai has no relation whatsoever to the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived approximately in the 5th to 4th century BCE in Nepal. The true Siddhartha Gautama was the complete opposite of the rotund figure. He was an ascetic, a prince who willingly renounced luxury and spent years in severe self-discipline, eating very little and subjecting his body to rigorous trials. Traditional representations of Gautama depict him as a slender, often very thin person with delicate facial features. His spiritual journey commenced with a renunciation of bodily pleasures. The Buddha's teachings are based on the middle way, a balanced approach between asceticism and hedonism. However, the middle way does not imply living in comfort and rubbing one's belly. It is a philosophical concept that stands in opposition to extremes, both excessive self-torment and indulgence in desires. Within Buddhist teachings, wealth and physical comfort are more often seen as obstacles to enlightenment rather than indicators of it. How did this misconception arise? Through a cultural synthesis. As Buddhism spread from India through Central Asia to China, it absorbed local beliefs and imagery. Chinese folk religion valued symbols of abundance and good fortune. The figure of Budai, a joyful, generous figure bringing gifts, perfectly matched this demand. Merchants, eager to display a talisman at their entrances that would bring prosperity, favored the cheerful fat man over a stern ascetic. This imagery spread through trade networks and gradually, over several centuries and cultural filters, was adopted by Western tourists and traders as an image of Buddha. This myth ultimately became entrenched in Western pop culture. Today, millions of people around the globe purchase Buddha figurines, rub his belly for good luck, and remain unaware that they are venerating the image of a medieval Chinese eccentric monk, unrelated to Buddhist philosophy or its founder. The true historical Buddha sits in temples in a different pose, lean, focused, far removed from commercial good fortune. This myth was created by commerce. The next was shaped by politics. Myth number 12. Confucius, the official who was dismissed. Confucius, the great sage of China whose teachings have shaped the system of governance, social order, and morality for over 2,500 years. The one whose Lun Yu, Analects, laid the foundation for Chinese culture, and, of course, a high-ranking government official who successfully embodied his teachings in the practice of administration. The latter is a myth. And this myth is particularly enlightening. Kongzi, the real name of Confucius, was born around 551 years before our era in the state of Lu, into a declining aristocratic family. He did hold government positions, but not the kind typically attributed to him in simplified retellings. In his mature years, he apparently occupied mid-level posts within the Lu administration, possibly serving as a grain storage overseer or a supervisor of public works. Some sources mention a position as Minister of Criminal Punishments, but these accounts are unreliable and disputed by historians. The key fact that undermines the image of a successful high-ranking official is that Confucius spent much of his adult life in exile. Approximately from 517 to 484 BCE, around 13 years, he wandered with a small group of disciples through various kingdoms in search of a ruler willing to accept him into service and allow him to implement his political ideas. No one agreed. Rulers received him politely, listened, offered hospitality, and sent him on his way. His concepts regarding ritual, virtue, social order, and enlightened governance seemed to them either utopian or inconvenient. Confucius returned to Lu as an old man, a disillusioned politician who never received the chance to put his teachings into practice. He passed away in 479 BCE at approximately 72 years of age, reportedly uttering words about the lack of a wise ruler willing to take him on as a mentor. The irony of Confucius's story lies in the fact that his ideas on governance were not adopted during his lifetime or in his kingdom, but several centuries later, when the Han emperors made Confucianism the official state ideology. Confucius was a failure in life and a pillar of civilization in death. The second layer of the myth is the content of his teachings. In popular imagination, Confucius is viewed as a sage dispensing maxims about harmony and respect for elders. The real Confucius was a political reformer, concerned with very specific issues. How should a city-state be governed? What are the ruler's duties to the people? What is the role of ritual in maintaining social order? His teachings were primarily a political philosophy, and only secondarily an ethical system in an abstract sense. The man who became a symbol of Confucian governance never held a state position that aligned with his ideas during his lifetime. This myth portrays a person of power who did not possess power. The next myth concerns the state, which is often viewed as monolithic. Myth number 13, the Sparta we invented. This is Sparta! Muscles, spears, red cloaks, terse phrases, and a relentless military culture. Cinema has created an image of the Spartan polis as a pure war machine, a state with no place for art, poetry, music, or philosophy. Only war. Only discipline. Only death. Real Sparta was a significantly more complex and perhaps stranger place. To begin with, Sparta was one of the largest centers of Greek culture, especially during the Archaic period, from the 8th to the 6th century BCE. Laconian poetry was highly valued in the ancient world. Tyrtaeus, a 7th century BCE Spartan poet, wrote military elegies that became classics of Greek lyric poetry. Alcman, who lived around the same time, composed choral songs, Parthenia, which were performed during religious festivals and have survived in fragments that impress with their lyrical brilliance. Spartan women enjoyed a level of freedom that was unattainable in Athens. They publicly engaged in gymnastics, which horrified and amazed guests from other polis. They had the ability to own property. They were able to voice their opinions. The famous laconic sayings attributed to Spartan mothers, "Come back with your shield or on it," depict a culture where women held considerable social status. Sparta actively engaged in diplomatic affairs. Spartan ambassadors were renowned for their eloquence, characterized by being succinct and precise, yet articulate, rather than silent. In religious practices, Spartans were conservative, though not primitive. Apollo Karneos was their principal deity, and his festivals involved singing, music competitions, and poetry. It was during the religious festival of Carnea that the Spartans were delayed at Marathon. They could not embark on a campaign during sacred days. The famed agoge, the system of education for Spartan boys, was indeed rigorous. However, it included instruction in music, dance, and oratory. A Spartan warrior was expected to be able to chant war hymns and articulate his thoughts succinctly and accurately. This, too, was part of his military training. So, where did the image of Sparta as an entirely anti-intellectual military machine originate? In part from Athenian sources. Athenians viewed Spartans with a mix of envy and disdain, and their portrayals were not always impartial. Additionally, by the classical period, the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, Sparta had indeed become more insular and solely focused on military matters. Furthermore, the Spartans themselves intentionally promoted the image of the stern warrior as part of their propaganda. Much of this misconception also stems from Zack Snyder's film 300, which transformed Frank Miller's graphic novel into a global cultural phenomenon. Real Sparta was a state with a vibrant cultural life, especially in its early years, that eventually prioritized military superiority at the cost of cultural decline. This choice is, in itself, tragic and instructive. However, to start this narrative with the assertion that there was no culture in Sparta misses the most intriguing aspects. This myth was birthed by cinema, and the next was born from our inattention to details. Myth number 14. Gray castles were never gray. Medieval castles, dark, grim, gray stone behemoths looming over valleys. Inside, dimness, torches blackening the walls, drafts sweeping through the corridors. Outside, a dismal stone devoid of any ornamentation. This is the visual language of any historical film or game set in the Middle Ages. The actual medieval castles were painted in vibrant colors. This detail, well known among architectural historians and restorers, scarcely permeates public consciousness. Yet, it is corroborated by both written records and chemical analysis of preserved stone surfaces. Castles and cathedrals were plastered and painted, white, red, yellow, blue. Some were adorned with heraldic patterns, stripes, and other decorations. The White Tower in London, the very central tower of the Tower, was not named white by chance. It was whitewashed on the outside during the medieval period. White paint symbolized royal power, purity, and strength. Many English castles were regularly coated with lime, which was refreshed every few years. French and German castles were adorned in shades of red, yellow, and terracotta. The heraldic colors of knights, red, blue, gold, and black, were displayed on the walls both inside and outside, declaring the castle's affiliation with a specific family. Interiors of castles, often portrayed in films as dark, damp chambers, were actually plastered and decorated with frescoes. Fragments of medieval artwork discovered during restorations reveal rich narrative scenes, biblical themes, and hunting motifs, vivid and meticulously detailed, covering large areas. Floors were adorned with tiles featuring colorful patterns. Fabrics such as tapestries, curtains, and cushions added warmth and color. So why have we come to associate gray with these structures? Because gray is the color of exposed stone once plaster and paint have crumbled away over centuries of neglect. Many castles, now tourist attractions, stood for centuries in ruins, and it was in this state that the Romantic movement of the 19th century rediscovered them. The Gothic novels of Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe created the image of somber gray ruins, an aesthetic norm that was later replicated in art, theater, and film. We see skeletal structures and mistake them for living entities. The true Middle Ages were far more vibrant, noisy, and visually rich than what cinema depicts. People of that era lived amidst colors, valued them, and invested considerable sums to ensure their walls gleamed. This myth reflects our perception of the past. The next one concerns those who built that past. Myth number 15. The Colosseum and the slaves who were not there. The Colosseum, the greatest amphitheater of the ancient world, holding up to 50,000 spectators. A symbol of Rome's might, yet also a testament to its cruelty. Its construction was made possible by the sacking of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. Flavius Vespasian utilized the spoils and captives to fund this grand project. For this reason, and also because construction in antiquity is generally associated with slave labor, it is often assumed that the Colosseum was built entirely by slaves. This is not correct, or, more precisely, It is an incomplete truth that distorts history. The construction of the Colosseum, officially named the Flavian Amphitheater, began around the year 70 AD under Vespasian and was completed under Titus in 80 AD. Excavations and analysis of construction inscriptions conducted in recent decades have yielded surprising results. Among the builders of the Colosseum were documented skilled workers of various professions who received wages: stonemasons, carpenters, architects, aqueduct engineers, painters, and mosaicists. Inscriptions record payments to specific workers. The professional construction workforce in first-century Rome was quite diverse. Some of the builders were indeed slaves, whether state-owned or belonging to private contractors. However, a significant portion consisted of freedmen and free laborers, including foreigners who had acquired citizenship or some privileges of it. There were skilled artisans who worked for wages and formed something akin to professional associations known as collegia. Jewish captives, taken after the destruction of Jerusalem, were indeed used for heavy auxiliary tasks like quarrying and transporting stone. But for the construction of a complex engineering structure like the Colosseum, merely having enslaved labor was insufficient. The intricate architectural solutions, the system of vaults, arena mechanisms, and acoustic calculations all demanded highly qualified specialists who could not operate effectively under coercive systems. The grand building projects of Rome, such as the Pantheon, aqueducts, and roads, were constructed through a sophisticated system. State contracts were carried out by private contractors who hired a mixed workforce comprising slaves, freedmen, and free workers. This system was pragmatic rather than ideological. The notion that the Colosseum was built solely by slaves arose from a comprehensible impulse to connect a symbol of Roman brutality, gladiatorial fights, with another symbol of the same, slavery. This connection makes sense from a moral and rhetorical viewpoint. However, historical reality does not always conform to rhetorical logic. This myth pertains to construction. The next one relates to destruction. Myth number 16. Tamerlane was not a successor of Genghis Khan. Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame, was a conqueror whose campaigns from the late 14th to early 15th century left behind mountains of skulls from India to Turkey. He is generally considered a direct continuation of Genghis Khan's legacy, a Mongolian conqueror embodying the will of the Great Steppe. He is referred to as the last great nomadic conqueror, a successor of the Mongolian military tradition, with his campaigns seen as a natural extension of Mongolian expansion. This portrayal is a skilled piece of propaganda, intentionally crafted by Tamerlane himself and uncritically accepted by us. Timur ibn Taragai Barlas was born in the year 1336 in Kesh, modern-day Shahrazabs in Uzbekistan. He was a Turk from the Barlas tribe, which was formerly counted among the Mongolian tribes, but had become Turkified and spoke the Turkic language by the 14th century. He had virtually no Mongolian blood, or at least his connection to the Chinggisid dynasty was quite remote. The challenge for Timur was as follows. In the then Turco-Mongolian world, only the descendants of Genghis Khan, the Chinggisids, had the right to bear the title of Khan and to lay legal claim to power. Timur was not a Chinggisid. How did he resolve this issue? Brilliantly and shamelessly. Firstly, he married Saray Mulk Khanum, the widow of the last Khan of the Chagatai Ulus, who was a genuine descendant of Genghis Khan. This allowed him to adopt the title of Gurgan, son-in-law of the royal lineage, and to inscribe the names of formal Chinggisid puppet Khans on his coins and documents, from which he allegedly ruled. De jure, Tamerlane was always merely a commander. De facto, he was an absolute ruler. Secondly, he actively constructed his own genealogy. In his official biographies, crafted by court historians, a legend emerged, claiming his descent from Genghis Khan through a complex chain of ancestors. Although this legend does not stand up to critical scrutiny, it served its purpose as effective propaganda. Thirdly, and this is the most astonishing aspect, Tamerlane was a devout Muslim. While Genghis Khan adhered to shamanism and his descendants embraced various faiths, Tamerlane built part of his legitimacy on the image of being a defender of Islam. He defeated the Golden Horde partly under the pretense that its Khans were not sufficiently zealous in their practice of Islam. He demolished pagan and Nestorian Christian centers in Central Asia. This does not align with the image of Genghis Khan's policy, who proclaimed religious tolerance as one of the principles of his state. Finally, Tamerlane obliterated what remained of the Mongol states that were successors to Genghis Khan. He defeated the Golden Horde, weakening it so severely that it never recovered. He launched attacks on the Chagatai Khanate. Rather than fostering Mongolian continuity, he was destroying it, clearing the way for his own empire. The portrayal of Tamerlane as a new Genghis Khan is his own image project, one that we descendants have accepted as truth. This myth was crafted by the conqueror himself. The next myth was produced by those who sought to simplify history beyond its complexities. Myth number 17. Castes that changed always. The Indian caste system is often considered the oldest and most rigid social order in human history. The four Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, are believed to have existed since ancient times, with every individual being born and dying within the caste they were born into. An unchanging hierarchy rooted in Vedic antiquity and unchanged for thousands of years. A monolith. The actual history of the Varna caste system is one of constant change, competition, regional diversity, and political manipulation. First, the Varnas, the four broad categories described in the Rig Veda and other Vedic texts, and Jati, the real endogamous groups that we typically refer to as castes in a practical sense, are different entities. Varnas are a theological concept, while Jati represent social reality. The relationship between them has never been straightforward and has continuously evolved. Second, mobility within the system was indeed real, even if limited. Entire groups of Jati could, over time, elevate or lower their status through the accumulation of wealth, military conquests, marriages with higher status groups, or through religious patronage. Indian historical sources abound with evidence of such mobility. Many royal dynasties of the subcontinent belonged to castes that were formally considered lower than Kshatriya, but gained Kshatriya status through political ascendance. Third, the system varied significantly across different regions. What was considered normal in Bengal might have been unknown in Rajasthan. Local Jatis had no counterparts in other regions of the country. The so-called all-Indian caste system was more a collection of regional systems sharing common principles than a singular monolithic structure. The most significant historical turning point that challenges the notion of an unchanging system is the role of the British colonial administration in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which played an enormous part in codifying and cementing caste as a rigid category. During population censuses, British administrators required each individual to specify their caste, thus transforming what had been a flexible and regional category into formal legal affiliation. Some groups, which previously claimed several different caste identities depending on the context, were fixed into a single category. Joanna Roche and other scholars of the colonial era demonstrated how the British policy of indirect rule, governing through traditional institutions, encouraged local elites to more rigidly define caste boundaries in order to maintain their privileges. The unchanging, millennia-old caste system was largely a product of colonial construction atop a more flexible historical reality. This does not imply that historical forms of social hierarchy on the subcontinent were not harsh and unjust. They were. However, they were dynamic and subject to change. The monolith is a construct of a later time. This myth of immutability is false. The next one pertains to language. Myth number 18. The French language, which was not always French. French is known as the language of diplomacy. This is common knowledge. For centuries, it was the medium for international negotiations, the signing of treaties, and the correspondence of courts. The very word diplomacy is associated with refined French speech and the parquet floors of Versailles. This is an ancient tradition with roots in the medieval period. However, French became the language of international diplomacy much later than is often believed, and it quite recently lost that status. For most of the Middle Ages and early modern period, Latin was the language of international correspondence. Letters between European monarchs, papal bulls, international treaties, university debates, all were conducted in Latin. Latin was not a living spoken language, but that was precisely why it suited diplomacy so well. It was neutral, comprehensible to educated individuals across Europe, and did not favor any particular party. French gradually began to replace Latin in diplomatic circles around the 17th century, when the French monarchy under Louis XIV emerged as a dominant power in Europe. The court at Versailles became a model for imitation. French fashion, French architecture, French cuisine, and the French language. Other European courts adopted French because association with this culture signified high status. An essential precedent was the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. A number of documents from this treaty were composed in Latin, while others were in French. Gradually, French began to displace Latin. However, the complete replacement took more than half a century. The Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 marked the first significant international document created entirely in French. This represents a real moment of symbolic transition. It's worth noting that the British side expressed protest upon signing it. The use of the French language gave France a symbolic advantage. French remained the language of diplomacy for approximately 200 years, until the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was drafted in two languages, French and English. This marked the first instance of equal status for English in international documents. By the mid-20th century, English had effectively supplanted French as the primary language of international communication. The eternal language of diplomacy dominated this role for about 200 years out of 3,000 years of documented diplomatic history. Before French, Latin was used, and prior to Latin, Greek and Akkadian were employed. This myth of French superiority is easily debunked. The next myth, concerning the Russian reformer, requires a bit more nuance. Myth number 19, Peter and the Beards, a joke that became a legend. In 1698, Peter I returned from the Grand Embassy, a journey across Europe during which he personally studied shipbuilding, artillery, and Western ways of life. He was filled with reformist zeal. And, according to a famous legend, he immediately set to work. Taking scissors, he personally cut the beards of the boyars with his own hands, laughing merrily, for fun. This tale circulates from textbook to textbook as an illustration of Peter's reformist persona, determined, unwilling to conform to tradition, ready to demonstrate personally that the old ways had crumbled. However, the real story is more complex and speaks to a far more serious political project than a royal prank. Indeed, Peter did personally cut a few beards. This is documented in sources. This took place during a reception at Boyar Shayan's shortly after his return. According to certain sources, the participants were not random boyars, but rather close associates and courtiers. This was more of a demonstrative act, a political performance, than a mere spontaneous joke. What makes this story far more intriguing is that in the same year of 1698, the beard tax was introduced, one of the most unusual fiscal instruments in history. Those who wished to keep their beards were required to pay the state. The amount depended on social status. For first guild merchants, it was 100 rubles per year. For other merchants and townspeople, it was 60 rubles. For nobility, 60 rubles, and for servants, 30 rubles. Peasants were allowed to wear beards for free, but they were charged a 2 kopeck fee upon entering the city. Upon payment of the tax, a person received a copper token featuring an image of a beard, along with the inscription, "A beard is an unnecessary burden." This document is considered one of the earliest in the world to certify the right to a specific appearance. The system functioned as an administrative mechanism for enforcing reforms through economic pressure rather than physical violence. Peter did not merely shear beards for amusement. He implemented a systematic policy of westernization regarding the appearance of the elite, recognizing that symbolic appearance bears political significance. In the consciousness of contemporary Russians, a beard was a marker of orthodox piety, a connection to tradition, and a facet of identity. A blow against the beard was a blow against the symbolic code of the old elite. This was a cultural revolution manifested through details of costumes and appearances. Simultaneously, there were regulations regarding attire, European dresses for nobles and townsfolk. Mandatory shaving for military personnel was instituted. This was a coordinated initiative aimed at altering the visual code of Russian society. The tale of Peter's personal grooming habits is indeed real. However, reducing it to a quirky episode instead of recognizing it as part of a systematic reform is a simplification that detracts from the true historical drama. This myth speaks of a reform that was more serious than it may seem. The next myth involves a death that was more ordinary than it appears. Myth number 20. Egyptian mummies, not just pharaohs. Egyptian mummies, golden sarcophagi, the curse of the pharaohs, hieroglyphs on the walls of tomb chambers. This entire image, constructed from countless films, novels, and museum exhibitions, is inextricably linked to one idea. Mummification is a privilege of the elite, primarily the pharaohs. This is one of the most widespread misconceptions about Egypt. Mummification in ancient Egypt was not solely the prerogative of kings. It was a business that operated at various price levels, offering a wide range of services for different social groups, similar to the modern funeral industry with its economy and premium packages. Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BC, described three categories of mummification pricing. The highest tier involved the complete procedure, including the removal of the brain and internal organs, with the use of sodium salt, linen bandages, and amulets, making it quite expensive. The middle category consisted of flushing the body cavity with cedar oil and seasoning. The lowest tier involved just cleansing and salting without organ removal. The most astonishing discovery in modern Egyptology in this regard is that cats, ibises, crocodiles, bulls, fish, and scarab beetles were also mummified. Millions of animal mummies were not an accident. They constituted an industrial production that catered to the market for religious offerings. Pilgrims bought mummified animals as gifts to deities in temples across Egypt. The scale of this production is staggering. Over 1 million animal mummies were found in the necropolis of Abydos alone. As for the social range of human mummies, those found include craftsmen, artists, merchants, lower-ranking priests, and soldiers. In Deir el-Medina, a village of workers who built royal tombs, mummies of laborers were discovered, carefully embalmed with great care. This is not royal extravagance, it is standard practice for anyone who could afford it. The mummies of children are even more telling. Among the discoveries are the mummies of newborns and infants, clearly belonging to families of moderate means. The Egyptian perspective on death and the afterlife made no exceptions for age or high status. Any Egyptian who had the resources for the most basic procedure could be prepared for eternity. Why then do mummies predominantly conjure up images of pharaohs and the elite in the collective consciousness? It is because their mummies have reached us in the best condition, with superior materials, techniques, and exquisite tomb protection. Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922, caused a sensation precisely because his tomb was found intact, and this image of immense treasures permanently linked mummies to royal luxury. The true narrative of Egyptian mummification is a story of popular religious practice, accessible in varying degrees to broad segments of Egyptian society. Pharaohs were merely the most extravagant clients in a long line. This myth highlights death as a great equalizer. The next one concerns the birth of a nation, which happened somewhat differently from what is written in textbooks. Myth number 21. July 4th, the day when nothing was signed. July 4th, 1776, the birthday of the United States. The day when the Founding Fathers affixed their signatures to the Declaration of Independence. An annual celebration, fireworks, barbecues. We hold these truths to be self-evident, along with the names of Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, and Hancock at the bottom. The issue? Most of these signatures were not made on July 4th. Let's break down the timeline. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring the colony's independence from Britain. It was this day, July 2nd, that John Adams referred to in his letters as the day that would be celebrated by future generations. He was confident that July 2nd would be recorded in history as the significant date. On July 4th, the final text of the Declaration was adopted, after revisions to Jefferson's draft. It was approved and sent for printing. It is indeed July 4th that is noted on the document, but as for the signatures, most members of Congress signed on August 2nd, 1776, nearly a month later. By that time, a clean copy had been made on parchment, and that is when 56 delegates affixed their signatures to it. Some signed even later, toward the year's end. Two of the signatories, Thomas McKean and Matthew Thornton, added their names in the autumn. John Hancock, the first signer, and he notably signed with such flourish that, according to legend, the British king could read it without spectacles, did so as President of the Congress on August 2nd. Another noteworthy detail: the document itself was not simultaneously announced as the Declaration of Independence. It was read in different locations on various days. Residents of New York heard it on July 8th. Some parts of the country recognized it even later. Why did the 4th of July become a symbolic date? In part, it was happenstance. This was the date printed on the copies that were distributed across the nation. Additionally, there was a political necessity for a definitive birthday for the nation. Just as a person needs a birth date, the nation required one, and the 4th of July simply became established in that role. When in the year 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration was adopted, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, it was perceived as an almost supernatural sign. The date acquired a sacred status. Since then, no one has questioned it further. This myth illustrates how symbolic dates come into existence. The next myth pertains to a state regarded as monolithic for another reason. Myth number 22, the Ottoman Empire, in which not everyone was Turkish. The Ottoman Empire is a Turkish state. This seems self-evident. It was founded by Turks, named after the Turkish dynasty of the Ottomans, and its capital was in Constantinople, now Istanbul, a Turkish city. Can it be otherwise? Yes, it can. Fundamentally different. At its height, from the 15th to the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most multinational and multi-ethnic states in world history. The notion of a Turkish state as an ethnic project not only misrepresented reality, but would have baffled contemporary observers. Let's begin with the ruling elite. The Grand Viziers, the de facto heads of government in the Ottoman Empire, were often not ethnic Turks. A particularly telling example is the Devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys from the Balkan provinces. These boys were converted to Islam and raised as state servants and military leaders. Many of them achieved high-ranking positions. The famous Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha, Grand Vizier under Suleiman the Magnificent, was a Greek from Parga. The Köprülü family, a prominent state dynasty that provided 6 Grand Viziers in the 17th and 18th centuries, was reportedly of Albanian or Greek descent. The Janissaries, the elite infantry and backbone of the Ottoman military, were formed through the Devshirme system as well. They were not Turks, but converted Muslims from the Balkans, Serbs, Greeks, Albanians, and Bulgarians. This paradox is striking. The most combat-ready segment of the Turkish Empire's army consisted of former Christians. The official language of the court and administration was Turkish, but only one of several. Arabic was the language of religion and law. Persian was the language of poetry and court culture, with most great poets of the Ottoman era writing in Persian. Greek and Armenian remained the languages of significant urban communities. Istanbul at its peak was a multilingual city where ethnic Turks constituted a minority. What about the position of non-Muslims? They lived within the millet system, confessional communities that enjoyed autonomy in matters of personal status, judicial proceedings, and education. This did not represent equality by modern standards. Non-Muslims were subject to additional taxes, could not serve in the military, and faced restrictions in various areas, but it was far from the total ethnic dominance typically associated with the image of a Turkish state. The term Turk during the early Ottoman period was rather derogatory in courtly circles. It referred to an uneducated Anatolian peasant, not a member of the ruling elite. Ottoman identity was determined by one's affiliation with Islam and the imperial institutions, rather than by ethnic background. The nationalistic reinterpretation of the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish state emerged in the 19th century under the influence of European nationalism and was fully realized in the 20th century with the establishment of the Turkish Republic by Ataturk, for whom the construction of Turkish national identity was a deliberate state project. This myth concerns a national identity created retrospectively. The next myth is about a journey that unfolded differently. Myth number 23. Vikings in America, not that coincidental. A storm, thick fog. A ship is blown off course into the open ocean. Days later, the wildered Vikings spot an unfamiliar shore. A serendipitous discovery of the New World, 500 years before Columbus. This is how the narrative of the Vikings' discovery of America is typically conveyed. This is a simplification that romanticizes the actual events and renders them less intriguing than they are. Leif Erikson's voyage around the year 1000 is the first documented contact between Europeans and North America. It was not a random occurrence. Rather, it was an exploratory expedition undertaken based on specific known information. The Saga of the Greenlanders, one of the primary sources, states that several years before Leif's journey, an Icelander named Bjarni Herjulfsson was indeed blown off course by a storm and glimpsed unfamiliar lands to the west. He did not land there, but returned to Greenland and reported his findings. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who established Greenland's settlements, purchased Bjarni's ship and hired part of his crew. He set off on a voyage with a mental map, or rather, an oral description of the route. This was a planned exploratory expedition relying on specific prior reconnaissance data. There was no randomness involved here, just as in most geographical discoveries, where pure chance is nearly never a factor. Another significant aspect is that the Norse settlements in North America were not temporary stops, but part of a long-term project. Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered by archaeologists in 1960 and now a UNESCO heritage site, was a permanent settlement that existed for several years according to available data. There, evidence of metalworking, structures of various types, and artifacts of Scandinavian origin have been found. This was an attempt at colonization, ultimately unsuccessful due to conflicts with the local population. The Normans referred to North America as Vinland, Markland, and Helluland. They named these places, indicating a perception of real geography that warranted understanding rather than merely viewing a chance shoreline. The discovery was intentional. The settlement was indeed real. The failure was also genuine. Conflicts with the Skrellings, as the Normans called the indigenous people, rendered permanent colonization unattainable. Yet, this is far more fascinating than simply saying, a storm swept the ship away. This myth arose from a romanticized view of adventure. Another was born from the need to justify the failure. Myth number 24. Medieval physicians and prayer. Medieval medicine. Prayers and bloodletting. No science, no anatomy, no understanding of physiology. Monks murmuring over the dying and barbers bleeding healthy individuals. The Dark Ages of medicine. This is a caricature that obscures the true history of medieval medicine. Medieval medicine was a structured system. It had its theoretical foundations, its educational institutions, and its practical methodologies. It was indeed flawed in many fundamental aspects. The humoral theory of Galen, which underpinned it, was incorrect. However, it never relied solely on prayers for healing. Medical schools in Salerno, southern Italy, existed as early as the 9th and 10th centuries and were the first systematic institutions of medical education in Western Europe. The Salernitan school developed diagnostic methods, compiled pharmacopoeias, and disseminated knowledge about medicinal plants. Islamic medicine, through translations of Avicenna, Albucasis, and Rhazes, integrated into European practice during the 11th and 12th centuries, introducing surgical techniques, pharmacology, and systematic clinical observations. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine was taught in European universities well into the 17th century. Surgery in the medieval period was far more advanced than commonly believed. Surgeons performed trepanation. Archaeological evidence suggests that some patients survived. Cataract removals, amputations followed by cauterization, tumor excisions, and abdominal surgeries for injuries. Albucasis, an Andalusian surgeon from the 10th to 11th centuries, authored an illustrated surgical treatise detailing over 200 surgical instruments. Bloodletting was indeed widely practiced and constituted a mistake that often hastened patient death. However, it was employed within the framework of the humoral theory as a logical method to restore fluid balance. This was a medicine based on an incorrect theory, but it was still medicine, not magic. Monastic hospitals, herbaria, hospitals affiliated with monasteries, truly combined medical care with spiritual support. Nonetheless, the remedies they used, tinctures, infusions, salves, had tangible pharmacological effects. Some, like mold-based preparations, even predated discoveries that we attribute to much later times. The weaknesses of medieval medicine were real and significant, but the idea of only prayers is a caricature rather than a historical fact. This myth pertains to ignorance that was more intricate than it initially appears. The next one concerns a discovery that was not as it has been portrayed. Myth number 25. Jacques Cartier and the Canada he did not discover. Jacques Cartier is often credited with discovering Canada for Europe. This assertion is written in numerous Canadian history textbooks and has long been accepted as a given. Several issues arise here. Firstly, Cartier arrived at shores that were already well known to European fishermen long before his time. Breton and Norman fishermen had been exploiting the waters off Newfoundland and Labrador since the late 15th to early 16th century. Portuguese navigators, the Cortereal brothers, explored the same coasts around the year 1500, nearly 35 years prior to Cartier's first expedition in 1534. John Cabot reached North America under the English flag in 1497. Secondly, when Cartier reached the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, it was inhabited, by no means sparsely. The Iroquois Confederacy, Algonquin peoples, and the Stadacona Nation in the area of present-day Quebec constituted complex, organized societies, complete with their political structures, trade networks, and cultural traditions. Cartier did not discover an empty land. Thirdly, and perhaps most strikingly, Cartier derived the name Canada from the local inhabitants. The Iroquoian word Canada meant settlement or village. He heard it when locals pointed to their village of Stadacona and mistakenly assumed it referred to the entire country. The discoverer of Canada named it after a term that predated him. Moreover, Cartier's first voyage in 1534 would literally have been impossible without the assistance of local navigators. He was unfamiliar with these waters and the territory. Native guides, including 2 young men from Stadacona whom he took along during his first season, led his expedition. What did Cartier actually accomplish? He conducted the first official reconnaissance of the St. Lawrence River on behalf of the French crown. He created maps. He oversaw the first French wintering on the American continent, which was arduous. His crew suffered from scurvy. He established the initial formal relations between the French monarchy and the peoples of North America. These are real and significant achievements. However, the notion of the discovery of Canada, as in the first European to see these lands, is incorrect. He was not the first. He was, however, the first official representative of France whose travels led to a French colonial presence. This distinction is important. This myth is about precedence. The next one concerns precedence as well. Myth number 26. Watt and the steam engine that already existed. James Watt invented the steam engine. This is one of the cornerstone narratives of the Industrial Revolution. The Scottish engineer in 1765 observes steam lifting a kettle lid, which inspires him to create an invention that will change the world. Watt did not invent the steam engine. He enhanced it, and that enhancement was revolutionary. But the essence of the matter lies precisely in this distinction. The steam engine as a principle existed long before Watt. Hero of Alexandria described the Aeolipile in the 1st century AD, a sphere that rotated due to steam pressure. This was more of a scientific curiosity than a practical device, but the principle had been established. In the early 18th century, Thomas Newcomen built the first practically usable steam engine, installed in 1712 for pumping water out of coal mines. Newcomen's machine functioned. It indeed pumped water. However, it was extraordinarily inefficient with a vast fuel consumption and low power output. When the young James Watt was repairing a teaching model of Newcomen's engine at the University of Glasgow in 1765, he noted its fundamentally inefficient design. The cylinder heated and cooled with each cycle, necessitating a significant steam expenditure. Watt proposed a fundamental solution: to move the condensation of steam into a separate vessel, a condenser. The cylinder remained hot constantly while the condenser stayed cold, significantly increasing the machine's efficiency. This was a brilliant engineering breakthrough, transforming the steam engine from an expensive pump into a versatile power source suitable for industry. Watt and his business partner Matthew Boulton created the first industrial steam engine in its modern sense. This is why Watt's name is justifiably associated with the Industrial Revolution. However, inventor of the steam engine, no, he was its transformer. The difference does not diminish Watt's accomplishments. His contribution is enormous. The distinction lies in the fact that the history of engineering thought is not composed of isolated, brilliant insights. It consists of cumulative progress, where each step builds upon the previous one. This is a myth about inventors. The next myth is about defeat. Myth number 27. The hemorrhoid that did not lose at Waterloo. June 18, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte suffers a defeat in the final battle of his career at Waterloo. Why? Because he was afflicted by acute hemorrhoids and was unable to personally lead the attack at the critical moment. Hemorrhoids changed the course of European history. This version has unexpectedly gained popularity. It is discussed in medical journals, cited in biographies, and has entered cultural discourse as an amusing historical anecdote. The issue is that it seems to be a gross simplification, elevating a secondary medical fact to the status of a historical cause. First of all, Napoleon indeed experienced health problems during the 100 Days, his final campaign before Waterloo. His biographers record a whole array of ailments: a cold, issues with his urinary system, possible hemorrhoids, and overall fatigue. In 1815, Napoleon was not the vigorous commander he had been at Austerlitz or Jena. He was 45 years old, and the years of campaigning were clearly taking a toll. But it was not hemorrhoids that caused Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. First, the delayed start of the battle. Napoleon waited for the ground to dry after the rains before initiating the artillery bombardment, was a tactical decision rather than a result of physical incapacity. Some historians view this choice as a mistake that granted Wellington time to strengthen his positions. Nevertheless, it was a commander's decision, not a forced pause due to pain. Second, the arrival of Prussian forces under Blucher was a critical factor. Napoleon had intended to defeat Wellington's army before the Prussians arrived. They came sooner than he anticipated. Marshal Grouchy, who was instructed to pursue the Prussians, did not engage in battle for reasons unrelated to Napoleon's health. Third, the assault of the Old Guard, Napoleon's last resort, was repelled not because he was feeling unwell. It was pushed back because the Prussian cavalry launched an attack on the French flank at a pivotal moment. Citing hemorrhoids as the reason for defeat at Waterloo is an example of medical reductionism seen in certain alternative historical narratives. This explanation is appealing because it is absurdly amusing, a monumental historical catastrophe explained through a mundane medical ailment. However, the story of Waterloo revolves around strategic miscalculations, unexpected allies, and the random nature of war, and cannot be distilled down to a single physical condition of the commander. This myth simplifies a complex reality. The next one simplifies the most intriguing aspects. Myth number 28. Hannibal and the elephants, without which he also crossed. Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. This image is one of the most unforgettable in ancient history: war elephants climbing snowy passes. The Carthaginian general leading an exotic army through unimaginable obstacles. This crossing stands as one of the greatest military endeavors of antiquity. All of this is true. However, the popular depiction of this crossing distorts its actual scope and significance. Firstly, the elephants in Hannibal's army during the crossing in 218 BC constituted a minor part. He began the journey with 37 elephants. By the time his army descended into the Po Valley, most of the elephants had perished from cold and exhaustion. According to various sources, only one elephant, named Surus, survived to the first major battles in Italy, and it was possibly commanded by Hannibal himself. Thus, the elephants that have become icons of this crossing played virtually no role in the Italian campaign, where Hannibal achieved his greatest victories, at the Ticinus, at Trebia, by the shores of Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae. Secondly, what exactly did Hannibal cross? Modern historians still debate the specific pass. Polybius and Livy, two primary sources, provide descriptions that poorly align with the particular geography. Versions of the Col de Clapier, Mont Cenis, and Col du Mont Genève each has its proponents. In 2016, an international team of scientists conducted a study of soil samples in the vicinity of Col de la Traversette and discovered traces of horse dung and parasites typical of North Africa, indicating precisely this pass. However, this is not the final answer. Thirdly, the true horror of the crossing was not in the elephants, but in the people and horses. Hannibal departed from Spain with approximately 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. By the time he reached northern Italy, he had roughly 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left. He lost more than half of his army to death, cold, desertions, and ambushes by local mountain tribes. This was a catastrophic depletion of forces even before the first battle. The fact that he inflicted 3 devastating defeats on Rome with his remaining forces, including the Battle of Cannae, one of the most horrific losses in Roman history, speaks to his military genius far more eloquently than any elephants ever could. Refocusing on the elephants is a simplification that takes the most exotic element of the story and puts it front and center, overshadowing the logistical, military, and human feats of much greater scale. This myth is about exoticism obscuring the essence. The next one concerns a tradition that did not exist until a certain point. Myth number 29. Samurai and Bushido. Written by descendants. Samurai, code of honor. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is an ancient moral code of Japanese warrior culture, guiding samurai in life and death. This image permeates everything from Hollywood films to management books that advise applying Bushido principles in business. The problem is that Bushido, as a formally written code, is not in quote, ancient tradition. Its main text was composed in the early 20th century and was largely written for a Western audience. Bushido, the Soul of Japan, is a book by Inazo Nitobe, published in 1911 in English. Nitobe, a Japanese Christian scholar who educated himself in Europe and the USA, wrote it in response to a question from his American wife about the Japanese concept of morality. The book was written in English for a Western readership, describing Japanese martial ethics through concepts familiar to European chivalric tradition and Protestant morality. This was a work about cross-cultural concepts, not a rigorous historical study. The actual term Bushido appears in Japanese sources very rarely before the 19th century. The concept of the way of the warrior as a formalized code appears in texts such as Hagakure by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, written in the early 18th century, but this was the text of a specific samurai from a specific domain, expressing his personal views rather than a universally accepted code. Real samurai of medieval Japan, the feudal period from the 12th to the 19th century, lived by much more pragmatic and contradictory rules. Betrayals, switching sides, political manipulations, and trade were all normal parts of a samurai's life. The Sengoku period, known as the Warring States era in the 15th and 16th centuries, was marked by widespread betrayals, where warlords frequently shifted allegiance from one lord to another with remarkable regularity. This stands in stark contrast to the concept of absolute loyalty to one's lord found in Bushido. The notion of seppuku, ritual suicide, indeed existed within samurai practice. However, it was not an obligatory standard for all. Many samurai experienced defeat in battle without resorting to seppuku. Numerous warriors lived on even after the death of their lord. Ronin, masterless samurai, were a normal facet of Japanese society, rather than outcasts bound to die. The romanticization of Bushido primarily took place during the Meiji era, spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Japan was undergoing significant modernization while simultaneously constructing a national myth around its unique martial traditions. The imperial ideology required an image of a disciplined, self-sacrificial warrior, which led to Bushido being rediscovered and redefined to align with these needs. The code that appears ancient to us was largely formulated during the age of steam and electricity. This narrative reflects a tradition that was invented. The last topic touches on resistance, which was less considerable than commonly perceived. Myth number 30. The almost non-existent French resistance. World War II, occupied France. In basements and forests, thousands of resistance fighters, Maquis, are active. They print leaflets, blow up bridges, assist Allied pilots in escaping, and relay intelligence to London. All of France resisted. De Gaulle was the voice, while the Maquis served as the hands of the entire nation. This image represents one of the foremost national myths of 20th century France. It was meticulously crafted by de Gaulle and post-war governments. It played a significant political role, allowing France to join the ranks of victorious nations, evade reparations, and maintain national dignity. It was also a considerable exaggeration. The actual involvement of the French in organized resistance by 1942, mid-occupation, is estimated by historians to be roughly 1% of the population. 1%. 1 out of every 100 French individuals. By 1944, as the Allies landed in Normandy and Germany's defeat became increasingly apparent, this number opportunistically rose. De Gaulle wryly remarked that half of France claimed to be part of the resistance. What did the majority do? They adapted. The Vichy regime, the collaborationist French government led by Marshal Pétain, enjoyed genuine support from a notable segment of the population, particularly in the early years of the occupation. Pétain was a national hero from World War I, and his authority was immense. Many French individuals sincerely believed that cooperation with Germany was the lesser evil, a means to preserve France from an even worse fate. The deportation of the Jewish population, one of the darkest episodes of this period, was largely carried out by the French police. The roundup of Jews in Paris in July 1942, known as Vel d'Hiv, was orchestrated by French authorities under German orders. More than 13,000 Jews from Paris, including approximately 4,000 children, were detained by French police. This does not imply that the resistance was not authentic or important. It was. Its participants risked their lives, often paying the ultimate price. They gathered intelligence that had genuine military significance. Networks that assisted Allied pilots in escaping from occupied Europe saved thousands of lives. By the end of the occupation, the Resistance became a substantial military force. However, the assertion that most French people resisted is inaccurate. The historically accurate picture is far more complex and painful. France needed a national myth post-war, one that would enable society to move forward, and de Gaulle, a shrewd politician, consciously and skillfully constructed this myth. Historians who began to challenge this narrative in the 70s and 80s faced real social pushback. The truth about the French resistance reveals how people behave under conditions of intense fear and coercion. The majority seeks to survive. The minority chooses to resist. A handful act from the very beginning, when the outcome remains uncertain. These few deserve remembrance and respect precisely because they were few in number. The myth of a nationwide resistance undermines their heroism, dissolving it into a fabricated majority. 30 myths. 30 stories about how humanity has preferred a beautiful lie over an uncomfortable truth. About how images were created by politicians, writers, descendants, and how they outlived their creators, becoming obvious facts for subsequent generations. Yet every myth has another side. Behind each revelation lies the story of real individuals, complex, contradictory, and not at all resembling the flat figures of legends. The real Pheidippides ran 6 times further than we imagined. The historical Genghis Khan developed a writing system for an entire people. The actual Hypatia was killed by politicians, not fanatics. The true resistance was the triumph of a minority rather than a majority, and that is precisely what makes it a triumph. History does not require embellishments. It is rich enough on its own.